The old forgotten pre-Christian mythologies and philosophies of the West, whether we're talking about the otherworldly stories of Celtic Ireland or the magical Finnish sagas or the soul-centered myth-tellings of Plato in ancient Greece, all of them really are quite rich and complex and beautiful. And they offer up not just a planet, but an entire cosmos in which everything is alive and has purpose of its own. So they speak of a world to which each incarnated soul chooses to come, and for a reason, to fulfill its own unique calling and to offer up a gift which can only be expressed through relationship with and participation in that animate world. So I believe it's time to reclaim those indigenous ways of being in the world, those foundation stones of Western spirituality which we threw away so long ago, and to use them to plug ourselves back into the web of life on this planet. We've lost sight of everything that mattered to us over the last couple of millennia, and we've forgotten that we live in a world that is as deeply full of soul as we imagine that we ourselves are. And as James Hillman and Carl Jung both said in their different ways, we think that psyche is inside of us, that soul is inside of us, but actually we are inside psyche. We're inside the world psyche, the world soul, the anima mundi of ancient Western tradition. And that really, I suppose, is what all of my work is about. It's about courting that world soul through cultivating the mythic imagination and learning to listen to its language. The mythic imagination, in the way that I teach it, is all about the ability to see beyond the everyday, to see more deeply and beyond this moment of our lives. And it's to have a concept of what our own journey is in this life, our own unique mythopoetic identity, you might say, and how it might relate to larger forces that are at work. So in a Jungian depth psychology way of looking at the world, imagination really is the foundation or the structure of the psyche, and myth or story is the language of the psyche. So if we work with personal myth or fairy tale narratives and imagery, or with journeying and dream work and land-based connection and listening practices, each of us, I believe, can find our own unique bridge to the imaginal world, what the ancient Sufis used to call the mundus imaginalis, or the richly mythical and archetypal otherworld of the Gaelic tradition to which I belong. Because the old Irish stories very clearly tell us how deeply interwoven this world is with that other world. And it's always seemed to me that in this country we always walk with one foot in the other world. We know it. It's our inheritance. So story really is critical to all of this. And if you think about it, all of the best European fairy tales are very much about negotiating with the land or negotiating with the wild, both inside and outside of ourselves. So these stories show us a world in which it's possible for humans to be fully enmeshed. So an animal or a bird might have something to teach us. A tree or a plant can cure us or save us. There's always a wise old woman or a wise old man in the woods to help us. And these are the stories which show us that in the world there is a sense of mystery, there's a sense of layers of knowledge that we can probe, of things still to be uncovered, of a wildness that we haven't even really begun to plumb the depths of. Myth is wild. It won't be tamed. It won't be told how to be. Myth's a shape-shifting creature. If you try to own it, it'll slip right out of your hands. You have to learn how to court it. And that's a lifetime's work. It's a holy mystery. It's the holiest of all mysteries. And I think something in us remembers mystery and longs to be swept away in it. Before there was the word, there was the land, and it was made and watched over by women. Stories from almost every culture around the world tell us that once upon a time it was so. For many native tribes throughout America, Grandmother Spider continually spins the world into being. For the Andean peoples of South America, Pachamama is the world mother. She sustains all life on earth. And in Scotland and Ireland, the Cailleach, the old woman, made, shaped and protects the land and the wild things on it. So a lot of my work over the past few years has been about trying to reclaim the lost voices and the stories of the feminine. And that's really quite easy to do in the Celtic tradition, particularly in the Irish tradition, because Irish mythology is very goddess-centred. And so all of the shows are run by divine women who hold all of the moral and spiritual authority of the other world. And so the women in those old stories also are very deeply rooted in place. So most Irish goddesses are, in some sense, representatives of a quality of the goddess of the land that is called sovereignty. And sovereignty has nothing in this context to do with personal power. It's very much about the ability of the goddess of the land to choose the rightful ruler, to choose a king who would live in balance and harmony with the land. And this was a really important concept in the old days, so much so that right up until the 16th century in Ireland, there was something called a sacred marriage, in which the king literally, during his rights of kingship, the king married the land. And that contract, everything was fine as long as the contract was kept and the king and the people lived in balance and harmony with the land. But if the contract was broken in any way, then the land became a wasteland. To me, the wasteland is very much a metaphor for the world that we've inherited today. And it's the hollowness inside us, as well as the wasteland we've made of so many parts of this planet. And we're bleeding at the roots because we're out of touch with the seasons and the cycles of the year and with the natural world to which we've completely forgotten that we belong. And we've forgotten how to listen to the song of a mountain or to the whisperings of trees or to the wisdom of a crow. And when we lose our relationship with the land and the other creatures which inhabit it alongside us, then in the deepest sense, we lose ourselves. But we've got to wake up now. These are mythic times, and we need to plug ourselves back into the mythic every day. And as Rumi said, we don't go back to sleep. We have to dive deeper. So everything I do really is rooted in place and in developing a strong sense of belonging to and relationship with place. And I've often thought that we believe that we imagine our places, we imagine the land, but I think there's a sense in which our places also imagine us, in which the exterior landscape comes to reflect our interior landscape, and maybe, who knows, vice versa. And it's all based on the premise that places are alive and that places thrive on relationship. And the places that I'm talking about, they don't really care where you come from. They just actually care that you're here and that you're willing to show up. The greatest of my place teachers was the wildest and remotest part of the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. I spent 4 years there, right at the end of what's known as the longest cul-de-sac in Europe, where the road gives out into sea and mountains, and if you're not careful, the heart can give out along with it. We spent every day of those 4 years, it seems, battered by storms. It really was a place of extremes and a place that required you to pay attention. And in that place, just as in Ireland, the mythology tells us that the land was created and shaped by an old woman, the Cailleach. She's the divine hag, the old woman of the world. In a sense, she's our Baba Yaga. She's one of those old women in the old stories who always walk the edges. The Cailleach is a wilderness spirit who protects wild animals. She's always portrayed as the guardian of wild nature, so folktale after folktale tells of her turning away the hunting men who were slaughtering too many of her deer, or of her protecting the wild things she loves and turning back the axes which cut down the forests, or tricking the priests and the saints who want to steal away her wild elemental power. So there's a burning fire in her heart that just won't tolerate the rape of the natural world. And what I particularly love about her is that she won't allow that rich, earthy, ancient power of women to be boiled down and dished up all milk white and saccharine either. She really doesn't do platitudes or sermons or homilies, and she's had more than enough of the preacher man. Hers is the love which faces down the hunter, which turns him back, which says no, refuses, guards, protects. So I want us all to love the earth like that, to love the earth like that old woman who created and shaped it, who danced across the mountaintops in our old mythology, waving her blackthorn stick and driving her beloved wild deer herd ahead of her. Because that's a love that's ferocious, And I think that that's the kind of love often that we face as we grow older, a kind of fierceness that knows when to say no, that knows when to hold up its hands and say, no, that's enough. You don't get to do that again. You don't get to do that ever again in my name. And that, to me, is what the stories of the Cailleach are teaching us. And myth is a great teacher. Myth is, as Canadian scholar and writer Sean Kane once said, the power of place speaking. And all we need to do is remember how to listen. If women remember that once upon a time we sang with the tongues of seals and flew with the wings of swans, that we forged our own paths through the dark forest while creating a community of its many inhabitants, then we will rise uprooted like trees. So once we used to think of ourselves as native to our places. Once we used to belong, we used to have that strong sense of belonging to our places. And the very early literature of Ireland, like so many other European countries, shows us a culture in which there's very little separation between humans and the land and the animals and the trees and the other beings that inhabit it with us. But that way of being in the world has long been overwritten. And as to use a phrase that D. Stevenson Bond, a Jungian writer, once used, we've fallen out of myth. And I guess my work, my job in the world is very much about trying to pick up those pieces of ourselves that broke when we fell out of myth, and to find a way of drinking from that well of wisdom again. Because it's more than time for us to become native to our places again, and to find a radical way of belonging to the places where we live now, where our feet are planted, no matter whether we think we're here forever or whether we're just passing through. It doesn't really matter. It's about finding that sense of responsibility for the earth, finding that old sense of stewardship, of needing to take care, of needing to literally to find our mythic ground again. So at the heart of my work is the belief that, as Carl Jung said, humans have always been myth makers. And the thing is that when our cultural mythology fails us, and ours for sure is failing us right now, both us and the planet, then that myth-making power, he said, reverts to individuals. So every one of us needs to take back that myth-making power from all of the decadent forces that govern us, and to reclaim the stories we actually really want to live by. Our own stories and our own voices. Because we really need to listen to those stories which spring up from the land that we live in. These are the stories which sing our souls back home, all the way back to the soul of the world, to the anima mundi. If there is to be change, it will come from us, right here, where we stand. Women were always the story givers, the memory keepers, the dreamers. Listen now to the land's long dreaming. Do you see what it's dreaming? It's dreaming you.